Hello and welcome to Medyascope. We are in Providence, Rhode Island, United States at Brown University, and I'm here with two great postdoctoral research associates from the psychology department who are working for the humanity-centered robotics initiative at Brown University, Dr. Elizabeth Phillips and Dr. Maartje de Graaf. So, since robots have become commonplace in every aspect of our lives, studying the interaction between humans and robots have become more important. So today we're going to talk about the multidisciplinary field of human-robot interaction and the psychology research in the field. So I want to start with the origins of the HRI field before moving on with the research. So, of course, robots have been in our lives for quite some time now, but the interaction of humans and robots was not a very popular area back then. So my question is, how and when did this HRI field rise to prominence, and when did they start to do psychological studies on this?
Good question.
Okay.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I believe it started around 2000. That the field human-robot interaction started to be a thing.
In the robotics domain around that time, there were some pretty significant advances that were made, and by that I mean that robots started to be used for very specific tasks. So they got smaller, they were more mobile, and robots started to be used in like search and rescue type of domains, primarily for teleoperated tasks. So you'd have a remote operator kind of controlling the robot. And here in the United States, a notable incident where robots were used quite heavily was after 9/11, when the search and rescue teams were searching for people in the rubble. So around that time too, the military started using them for similar reasons. We had like bomb disposal robots, and I think the coupling of robots becoming small, lightweight, and packable, plus like having this impetus for using them more, is really when the domain started to gain prominence, I think, and more people started studying it. Psychologists came in later because they found that in using these robots, there were a lot of problems that people were having. Like teleoperating robots is actually a really difficult task, so people needed a lot of help to be able to do it well.
And then later on became the interest from psychology, because people tend to respond quite socially to robots, even if they display very simplistic behaviors. And I believe one of the first studies done in the domestic environment were like 2003 or 2005 were the earlier studies with the Roomba, the vacuum cleaner robot. And that is actually one of the first robots that became spread to be sold.
Yeah, to like everyday consumers.
Yes.
Outside of military and that sort of thing.
Okay, so we talked that, as you mentioned, there's the HRI research is an application in military, and I know that you also have worked with the Army laboratory. So do you want to talk about your research on the robot-soldier interaction?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So in graduate school, my primary research responsibilities were for this large collaborative project called the Robotics Collaborative Technology Alliance. It's actually still going on, and the goal of that project is to to transform robots from these teleoperated, largely completely remote controlled systems by humans and make them more like teammates. So they would be a lot more autonomous. Like you could say to the robot, I want you to go over there and watch what happens at that building and report back to me if you see any bad guys. So that's an effort that's been going on for a long time. I would say they're pretty far from being able to get a robot to actually do that, but in order to make robots better teammates, one of the things that we're doing is studying how people are good teammates and trying to apply some of the things that we learn from that domain and see if we can build similar types of behaviors in robots. So for instance, good teams often know that I should communicate information to you proactively and when you need it. So we're trying to model those same types of behaviors in machine learning and trying to get robots to do similar things.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So of course, robots are not just in the military, but also in our homes. And I know that you, Maartje, have worked with domestic robots. Do you want to talk about your research on the user acceptance of domestic social robots?
Yes, it's quite a broad question. During my PhD research, I focused on user acceptance of social robots in the homes, and well, there were 2 bigger studies that were done in that 4-year period. One of them was a long-term home study, so I placed 70 bunny-shaped robots in people's homes that basically functioned as a smartphone does today with the different kind of apps. So what do you want to specifically know about that?
So what are people's expectations from the domestic robots?
Well, people's expectations are actually quite high because probably they are influenced a lot by the movies out there where robots are displayed like almost like human beings, socially interactive, cognitive, quite intelligent, and that's actually what my participants also expected because the university was coming with this social robot, so they had very high expectations. And when I actually came with a simple bunny-shaped robot, they were kind of disappointed. You can see that in the ratings they gave to it. However, when they were using it more and more over time, they learned to appreciate whatever the robot had to offer, and all the ratings went back up. And this is called a mere exposure effect. So this holds true for other things as well. If you use something for longer, you learn to sort of appreciate its mistakes or its flaws.
Okay, so usually people have high expectations from robots, but
Yes.
but is there a case where like the robot is actually smarter than people usually think, and then they're afraid to use the robot in the house?
I don't think that robots
No.
at this time can like be beyond people's expectations.
Yeah. I think in most instances, robots as they currently exist tend to kind of not meet high expectations. So robots still as they currently exist sometimes are very good at certain tasks, but they don't generalize well to other types of tasks. So it's really difficult to get a robot that's good at a whole bunch of different things. Like a Roomba, for instance, is great at running around your house, but nothing else. So it kind of like, it's really difficult to get like a multitasking sort of robot in the current stage where we're at right now. Things are changing, but slowly.
Then depending on how the robot looks, they can be like surprised by that one task that the robot is doing, but if the robot looks like it can do other things, then people are expecting that robot to do that as well, and then they are disappointed that it can't.
Oh, so the appearance of the robot also plays a role.
Yeah,
huge role.
Yes.
So Maartje and I have both done research in this area, and we found that people oftentimes expect robots that look like humans, for instance, to do things like humans would do or equally well, and they're just not at that point yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked about like humans as users of the robots, but the humans are also designers and engineers of robots. And there was an article on ProRepublica which we discussed, and it was on machine bias. It was more about the AI than robots, but we can still talk about it. So it was basically talking about the software used across the country to predict future criminals, but it was found to be biased against black people. So this is more of an example, of an AI. But so we always talk about like how robots are like rational agents unlike humans, and that's why we use them, I guess. But they still have human-like weaknesses. So like how do our biases influence the robots, and how does it play?
A lot, yeah. You want to start?
Well, it's basically, I think it's because people are the ones that program it, and all the data that is out there on the internet is human data, and that data is biased, and the robot is learning from that data, so it probably even magnifies whatever bias there's already in the data.
Yeah, you can see examples of this. There was a Twitter chatbot that was released maybe 4 or 5 years ago by Microsoft. It was called Tay AI.
Just last year.
Oh, was it last year? I'm sorry. Yeah, so in my brain it seemed like a lot longer ago, but it wasn't that long ago. So it was released, and the whole point was that it would kind of, learn through people's discussions on Twitter and then learn how to talk back to them, and it ended up being this magnification of all the horrible things that people can do on Twitter, not just all the good things. So like Maartje said, to echo the point, the way machine learning and AI and robots oftentimes learn is through big repositories of data that's supplied by humans. So sometimes we see that that magnifies bias that exists in the data. And that's hard to guard against because bias oftentimes is unconscious on our part. So this has become a hot topic in the field, and lots of people are talking about how to guard against it.
Yeah, the example of Thai actually says more about people.
Yeah, but it's something to be concerned about for sure. Because, and another point too that people have raised is that, you know, oftentimes people who create these things, computer scientists, people who work for Google, things like that, tend to also be predominantly male and white. You know, so if we're trying to build things for a more inclusive community, we need perspectives from other types of people. So that's a problem too. The field doesn't tend to be as diverse as the people who will end up using these things.
And I also think we need to be aware that this is not something of the future, but today already algorithms are deciding who gets a loan. Prison sentences are being like created by AI, and also, for example, your feeds on Facebook, the recommendations from Netflix, your Spotify account. That's all algorithms that have certain biases, and well, for your Netflix account, it doesn't really matter that much.
Yeah.
But for a loan or your prison
sentence,
sentence,
yes.
that's a huge difference. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked like robots can make mistakes. They don't always make the perfect decision. And when a robot makes a mistake, a wrong decision, do people tend to blame the robots? Like, I know that both of you have worked on blame studies and like the ethical dilemmas around the robots. Like, you would think that how is robot an agent in this? Like, a philosopher's opinion would be like robots can never be blamed, but people do, right? Actually.
Yeah,
So
well,
what
it's
was
research done in the lab. I'm not sure if you were part of that
Yeah.
research, but
So I would say that neither of us have done that work directly, but we work in a lab that does that research and has been doing it for a while. I would say there's a certain proportion of people that respond to those studies that do not believe that robots can be blamed, and usually those are the people that we say, like, okay, we can't really ask them questions of blame because they don't believe the underlying premise. As far as my personal opinion on whether robots can be blamed, I'm actually not sure. I'm still sort of on the fence about how that will work, because when we think about blame, we oftentimes think about like admission or guilt, or, you know, taking responsibility for whatever thing went wrong. And I don't know who else we would blame if we were not to blame a robot, because then you have to decide, well, is it the designer, is it the programmer, is it the company? Like, I'm not sure, and I know there are people talking about this, especially in terms of like autonomous vehicles, like how if an autonomous vehicle gets in an accident and accidentally hits someone, like, who bears the responsibility for that? I don't know. That's a good question.
well, I think legally it will be very problematic to have the robot or the autonomous car be the blameworthy entity or whatever. But I think from a psychological perspective, if the robot looks like it is intentionally doing something and there's no one or nothing else clearly connected to that, I think people will blame the robot.
Yeah, I can see them making that leap for sure. Whether or not they should, I don't know. And in the case of cars, I imagine some structure will need to be in place for establishing that. In the same way that insurance companies already sort of do establish blame and fault, but I'm not sure if people will be wholly satisfied with how that goes. It'll be an ongoing debate for sure.
Yeah, it's already happening for like simpler technologies. Like an example, if you hit yourself with a hammer on your thumb, you won't blame the hammer, right? But if your computer deletes data, you blame your computer. But it's probably you that did something wrong. And with robots, they're way more intelligent and they do something more on their own, autonomously. So.
Yeah, difficult position today.
Yes.
Is there a discussion on like how the legal aspect will be, like, especially with the autonomous cars, like how will the legislators decide like who is the person to blame or the agent to blame?
Yeah, there has been. So Maartje and I actually went to this great conference that happens once a year. It's called We Robot, and it's all about these issues, so robotics and policy, essentially public policy, and primarily it's attended by legal experts, lawyers. It's held at a law school. And that was really fascinating actually to see that conversation, because as psychologists, oftentimes we don't really engage in those sorts of questions. But what they were talking about from a legal perspective was very much in the case of like more how laws will be structured to establish those things, not necessarily like whether they were ethical or whether people will see them as correct, but how this sort of structure should be in place to establish that. And I think for cars, they're looking at how the legal system like sort of already works and seeing how that autonomous cars will kind of disrupt that system. So to answer your question, I don't think the way the policy works oftentimes doesn't consult people who understand sort of people's reactions to it, but it's more like how do we establish blame or guilt in response to like the law and sentencing and retribution for when things happen, how much money should be assigned to that, and things like that.
And usually law tends to be like the last thing to get fixed in the whole.
Sure.
Because first something needs to go wrong to alert people of the necessity to actually make a law for that instance.
It was really fascinating to see those discussions actually, because I had never really thought about it from the perspective of like, okay, if this, you know, what is the amount of money that you are owed if a robotic car does damage to your property? I never really thought about it in that way. Yeah.
Okay, I want to move on with a more interesting topic, maybe to many other people. This is also very interesting. With the romantic interaction between humans and robots, which was discussed a lot after the movie Her, in which the protagonist developed a romantic relationship with an AI. So like, is it possible for humans to fall in love with a robot, and like what are the ethical discussions around it?
Do you want to leave that?
David Levy, he really believes so, and if you read his books, or his book, which is based on his dissertation, it was quite convincing, like all the arguments that he made. So yeah, I think it's probably possible if a robot, well, interacts with you in such a way that is very believable, then I think there are certain people out there that are like receptive of that kind of love.
Yeah, so it's kind of, everyone like giggles, I think, when we talk about this. So, but yeah, there's a great book, Maartje mentioned it, David Levy. It's called Love and Sex with Robots. I recommend everyone read it. It's fantastic. Yes. Really good. We have 2 copies if you want to borrow.
Thank you.
But it's great, and he really lays the case for why, you know, he really does think that people will come to love robots, and the reasoning for why he believes that. And I think it's actually very convincing. Now the ethical kind of side of that relies on what does that, so if you believe that this robot loves you back, essentially, and is that okay? You know, are people okay in a one-sided relationship, or maybe what an outsider perceives to be one-sided? There's a lot of issues about, you know, am I projecting when I consider this to be emotions, that this robot or thing likes me back, and if I am, is that okay? You know, I'm of the mind that it doesn't bother me necessarily if people want to have those sorts of relations, but I do, from a ethical standpoint, there are other people that are very concerned about it. So I've gave a short talk about this, mostly inspired by David's book, and the types of questions I oftentimes get from the audience is, you know, how will that affect our human-human relations? Are people not going to want to be in relationship with humans? I think that's sort of an extreme case. I don't think that will be the case. But yeah, I think if you're talking about sort of the ethical discussions that surround that, I think a lot of them surround maybe this illusion of loving you back and whether or not that's really fair to the person who's in the relationship, and should those people be protected in some way. I don't know. I think there's probably parallels in human-human relationships, but and we don't regulate those. So, so I don't know, but I feel like these discussions are really fascinating, and that book is great.
Yeah, Maartje, for me, the scary part is that the robots could probably at some point, not right now, but if AI develops further, at some point a robot will be able to totally adjust or adapt to your preferences of a relationship to make, like, becoming the ideal partner. And I'm wondering how that will affect, well, not only love relationships, but also how you feel about friends. If, like, robotic others can be perfect friends, then maybe you won't be accepting, like, a human friend who is sometimes not a nice person
Yeah.
because they are people. So,
or maybe it's okay that, you know, your human friend challenges you on a personality trait that maybe is not the best,
Yes.
but your robot is totally fine with it.
so even our personal,
Yeah.
like we developing as people throughout life, maybe.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good perspective.
Because
yeah.
you learn from your interactions with other people. If you're not a perfect person, you get sometimes feedback on that, and that's better to make you a better person. And if a robot accepts
Yeah.
that, I don't know.
There's also some debate by some researchers in the UK leading sort of a movement against sex robots and relationship
Yes.
robots, and their argument is that sex robots oftentimes are female, portrayed as female, although that's not always the case. The ones that actually do exist, they do have male versions, but that this is a problem sort of for females in general, because their argument is that females are already sort of like unfairly sexualized and maybe vulnerable in situations, like in sexual situations, and by having this thing that, you know, you could argue doesn't have consent and all those sorts of things, like you're sort of kind of desensitizing people to women having control, actual women like having control over their own bodies and things like that. So there's a whole line of arguments around that domain as well. Yeah, I'm not an expert in their arguments, but I think they're fair and definitely worth considering. Yeah.
Okay. So moving on from love to fear. So like as people develop romantic feelings, they also develop fears of robots, which we see in many sci-fi movies, especially on the idea of robots taking over the world. So like, what do you make of it? Like, what's the psychological basis of this humans, the fear of humans, of robots?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that, because we are being fed by the public image of robots taking over the world, that people maybe fear it, and it probably is also related to like all the revolutions that we have so far with the Industrial Revolution, that machines took away jobs, and they are probably thinking that now robots will do that too. But I also want to stress that like the media image of robots taking over the world is something from the Western movies. Because if you look to the Asian culture, robots are much more displayed there as heroes, and the whole idea of fear of robots is less prominent in Asian countries, because robots are heroes there.
Interesting.
And I also read some things which is more related to religion. So our Western society is mostly based on Christian beliefs, and Christian beliefs say or that like life can only exist in living beings, whereas in Asian religious culture also objects can have a soul. So from their perspective, a robot can be like having a soul or a life in some way too. So that's why they are more accepting like robots being an entity as well, or social entity.
Yeah, I would say in Western media too, robots are often seen as like the combatant in those movies as well. They're less likely. Her was actually a good example, but she's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so another thing too is like I sort of see robots and AI as like similar sides, two sides of the same coin. And there's been quite a movement recently about like people signing, very high profile people like Elon Musk signing these open letters to the world saying that we really need to be aware of general AI and AI sort of taking over the world and stuff. But when you talk to a lot of AI researchers, including ones here at Brown, they say things like, you know, we think that's sort of a far-fetched idea, and it also makes the assumption that people who work on these AI robotics things that are kind of like doing so blindly and not paying attention to these societal issues. And that's simply, I think, not true. So there's two pieces to take away from there. I think that where AI is currently is not anywhere close to what that will be, and that I think that the people who are actually building these systems are concerned about, you know, displacing jobs, those sorts of things. So I think in the very near term, the things that are frightening about AI and robots are, you know, them taking jobs more so than taking over the world and wanting to kill us more generally. But yeah, I think a lot of that is just driven by media, and then also sometimes like high-profile people sort of like putting their foot down and then putting a stamp on it, and then like the way the media covers those sorts of things too.
So today we talked about the field of human-robot interaction and the many applications in our world and the psychology research. So thank you so much for joining us, Elizabeth and Maartje de Graaf. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Welcome.
Yeah. Goodbye. Thank you for listening.